All right, so these are mud pots. These particular mud pots happen to have been taken at the Salton Sea geothermal area in Southern California, and which is where I'm going to start talking. And so the Salton Sea geothermal field here is located down near the Gulf of California. In this area here, it runs right along the San Andreas Fault. It's the second largest geothermal operation in the U.S. I guess that's my only screen. I can use your screen. Tectonically and volcanically, it's very active. A very recent volcanic episode, maybe 2,000 years ago. It's hot and it's permeable, so it's, of course, kind of a dream case for geothermal resources. It is also extremely chemically reactive, which causes additional problems in other ways, but it's a great place to pull out geothermal energy. And so this is a conceptual idea here by Jeff Hewlin, who put together what he thinks the system looks like. And that provides a framework to explore how it might evolve. And so what we're going to look at first is, so we're taking this idea here and it becomes this simple model where we have a trough region that is a higher permeability sedimentary zone out, and it is contained within a lower permeability region here. In all cases here, permeability is defined not as a parameter itself, but as a function of the fractures within the system. And so you define, for instance, in this case, an orthogonal fracture network. This fracture has some initial aperture that defines it. That aperture responds to stress in some way. It responds to plasticity and shear in some way. And you modify that permeability as your system changes. And so if you look at this type of model, then you generate these circulation regions. In this case, this is velocity vectors and velocity contours, and the velocity vectors themselves are actually colored to the phase. So we have actually vapor here transitioning into supercritical into liquid up in this area here. But if you follow that on the same time in the same area on a plot of the permeability, it also seems to follow these pathways. So you have what are in effect very large scale permeability circulation patterns that move through the system. So in this case, these are thermo-elastically driven permeability, dilation, compaction of the fracture materials, and it follows the same pattern of circulation as your temperature does. Then in another, looking at permeability again in a different way, you have this paper by Philip Weiss and Thomas, looking at how permeability can create these kind of very interesting wave-like structures with the release of magmatic fluids when you have again these really high enthalpy magmatic systems that are driving your behavior. Yes. And so we're beginning to look at the influence of the deeper magmatic system as well. I have a poster on this happening right now, actually, so that's not what this talk is about. And in this case, we're working with Ozgai Karakas and Joe Dufek, and we are coupling their dike intrusion model in the lower crust and attempting to look at how this intrusion, when fed into a model as a boundary condition or as a source term, influences the structure of the hydrothermal system. And so just one example here, in this case we have, this is permeability in the background, and these vectors are displacement of the solid. And so we're just looking at the solid expanding here and spreading outward into the outside. But back to permeability. So I put this together a while back, and I think it's an interesting way to look at the coupling between processes that we don't necessarily always think of as being coupled. And so if you run a simulation on two reservoirs, they're identical in every way. They have the same initial permeability, they have the same structure. But one of them has calcite in the fractures, and the other one does not have calcite in the fractures. And you run this in an enhanced geothermal system kind of way, so you inject cold water. As the cold water comes in, the calcite dissolves into the cold water, the calcite moves away, your permeability increases, and your system changes. And so if you look at the difference between these two cases, so we have one where the reservoir does have calcite, one where it does not. The one with calcite, as the calcite dissolves and moves away, the permeability increases. And if you look at the stress difference between these two reservoirs, it's very large. And so, and in this case, you have, if you look at the difference in thermal breakthrough time, so we're injecting at one side and we're withdrawing from another. Then the calcite versus the non-calcite reservoir, you have a breakthrough time difference on the order of a year or 2 years. So it's a decent amount. And if you look at, if you take one point within the reservoir and you monitor the stress as it evolves, as your cold fluid is moving into the system, and you subtract that from the other reservoir, one with calcite and one with not, then you have these differences that evolve here. And so you have, presumably these happen as you have the passing of a cold front, and you have some difference. And so that's just kind of a fancy way to get at and to point out that simply the dissolution of calcite, which is in no way a mechanical process whatsoever, can lead to a fundamental shift in your evolution of stress. And so you have couplings that are what I call indirect couplings. And so that's getting to this. And so I, of course, also have a coupled diagram. This is mine. I would say that, so there is no such thing as decoupled. And my point here is, see, where'd my mouse go? There we go. So we have your typical fluid flow, mechanical deformation, heat transport, mineral transport, and alteration. And that while often these are linked directly with each other, often they're not, they are always connected via the permeability. And so you have this additional pathway where this constitutive parameter actually defines connections that don't exist between the processes themselves. So there's no such thing as decoupled. Every system is coupled. But the timescales matter. And so on the right, we have two plots. The top one is a conceptual idea of how permeability or a system might change in a geothermal reservoir. In this case, an enhanced geothermal reservoir, so we're injecting colder fluid. And what you might think would happen is that you have these chemical processes are a bit slower. So initially you have some kind of hydraulic response that is partially coupled with your thermal response in addition to that. The hydraulic comes up fast, the thermal comes a little bit later. If you follow your total, it looks like this. And then at some point, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, your system starts to evolve as a function of chemistry, and chemistry becomes as important as everything else. You can also model that, and what it looks like in some example of some reservoir is roughly that. You do roughly see that, is that you have kind of these initial thermo-hydromechanical behaviors that occur up front, followed by a chemical response. So this is a quote from IPGT, there is clear field and laboratory evidence for extreme heterogeneity and dynamic permeability in hydrothermal systems. I think we know that. Permeability enhancement is mainly a hydromechanical issue, or is it? And we'll look at that in a second. While permeability maintenance of a geothermal reservoir over a life cycle could be a geochemical issue. And the success of EGS requires increasing the permeability of a large volume of rock a lot without generating an unacceptable level of seismicity and maintaining that permeability in a geochemically active environment. So it's a difficult task. So what I'm going to do now in my last couple of minutes is introduce a new model. So this is a new spin on OpenGeoSys for those of you who are familiar with that. And in order to look at all of these types of systems that I've shown here, so if you go all the way back to these high enthalpy magmatic systems, these very complex equation of states, in addition to the complex mechanics that are involved in all of these systems as well, we had to make some modifications. So yeah, the equations of state capable of dealing with a magmatic system, so going to very high temperatures. The PDE coupling strategy has been changed, and so this is maybe my only equation that I show. Maybe I have one little other one. But you know, when you have a set of PDEs, you have choices with how you couple them together. And depending upon the strength of coupling within your system, you may often want to put all of these PDEs in the same equation. You may often want to put them in a different equation. You may want to put two of them in the same equation, but couple them on the right-hand side of that equation. You may want to couple them on the left-hand side. There are a lot of possible ways to do it, and depending upon your system, will determine what you choose. And so we wanted the flexibility to do that, and so that's what we have. And so essentially all the coupling occurs on the coefficient level, so each coupling coefficient between each PDE can be discretized in its own spatial way. It can be spatial, did I say special? Spatial way. Be that FEM or CVFEM. It can be coupled with different Gauss points, et cetera. So it's a fundamental object that exists on its own, and then that can be placed in any equation. So you have complete flexibility with how your PEs come together in your given system. I mentioned mixed discretization. We obviously need reliable plasticity in difficult environments. Running plasticity in these magmatic systems is extremely difficult. They're really dynamic, they're really nonlinear, they're really hard to control, and they really go out of control. And of course, permeability models that follow what you see physically. And so I'm going to look at one example case. And so thinking of the way that a fracture aperture will evolve, in our case, we're thinking about it in two ways. So you have compression of a fracture, and that, compression, say you choose to define it this way, which is often done, as some exponent of an effective stress and a coefficient. Oh, wait, is that what I'm looking at? Yeah, well, that works too. In addition to that, as you shear a fracture, so as you introduce plasticity into the system, you have these kind of spikes in fracture aperture, and so as you spike them, but then if you increase the stress, you may decrease them again, or if you have some aspect of creep that occurs, you can do this. And so overall, your fracture aperture tends to want to compress in some kind of a curve, dilate with plasticity, compress again, and the overall dilation follows something like this. And so we put in a nonlinear dilation area response in terms of the dilation of the fracture to a given amount of shear slip along that fracture. And it looks like this on the right-hand side here. And so the permeability, the fracture permeability, the aperture evolves nonlinearly, as we know they do from laboratory experiments. And so if you look at a radial symmetry layer cake type model, we're going to do a shear stimulation exercise. This image on the right shows you the domain here. So we have a reservoir, some injection zone, we have a cap rock, we have usual boundary conditions and rollers on the left. As you inject cold water, of course, over a great amount of time, you infiltrate that water into the reservoir. This amount of infiltration does not occur during a shear stimulation exercise. It takes time. But we wanted it to be very large. There are no boundary effects here. And that is that. But we're only going to talk about the short-term dilation. And so we have a constant pressure injection at 70 C. We're going to violate Byerlee's law by a little bit. We don't want to tensilely, we don't want to open the fractures, we want to shear them to create permeability. We have initial permeability that's very low and somewhat realistic. And what you see when you do this is you have, I'm just about out of time, you have an initial climb, an immediate climb in permeability, an immediate dilation due to the pressure response, and then a little bit later you have temperature that comes in and creates an additional amount of dilation. And that's what I want to look at, because it's often talked about that temperature is not really a critical parameter during these high pressure shear stimulation exercises. And in fact, in reality, it could be. And so what we want to look at is the magnitude, the cases under which temperature is actually important during a very short-term 5-day stimulation exercise. And so to do that, we switch over to a dual energy model. So this is local thermal non-equilibrium. In addition to all these coefficient couplings, you can also throw in additional temperature equations or enthalpy equations. And the transfer between one temperature equation and another energy equation is through transfer coefficients that depend upon the spacings of the fractures. And so what we want to do is look at two cases, one where we have a reservoir with very close spaced fractures and one where we don't. And so if you have very close spaced fractures, then your fluid temperature moves very rapidly into the solid. If you have very wide spaced fractures, then your fluid temperature does not. So you're injecting the cold fluid, it moves into the fractures, that fluid moves through, but it doesn't heat the rock very efficiently. And so if you look at those two cases and you run the same shear stimulation exercise, what you see is that in both cases you have this immediate pressure-induced shear response, as you would expect, and you increase your permeability by an order of magnitude or so. But in the case where you have well, in the case where the temperature is not being transferred very efficiently, you do not see this secondary response. And so I think that oh yeah, okay, here. So the comparison is between these two curves, both, so this is the dilation and this is the permeability. Both refer to the case where the temperature is able to move quickly into the rocks and the rocks are able to respond. And in the case where the fractures are widely spaced and the temperature does not move in very rapidly, you do not have the secondary response. So the importance of temperature is not obviously ruled out. It may be important and it may not be. But I think to just immediately make the assumption that it's not important is not accurate. And I think that's it. Thank you.